For 30 years, Helen believed she had the perfect life: loving husband, beautiful family, and the quiet routine of a marriage built on trust. But one day, everything changed. When she uncovered a hidden credit card statement, what she thought was a minor mistake turned out to be the first crack in a wall of secrets. Secrets that would reveal her husband's involvement in a dangerous criminal world and put her own life at risk. What happens when the person you trusted most isn't who you thought they were? Stay tuned to find out. The chilling truth is only the beginning. Helen had always believed in the perfection of her marriage to Paul. The house they had built together, the life they had crafted from the ground up, had been a dream come true. At least, that's what she told herself. Every morning, the sun would pour through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the porcelain tiles as she prepared breakfast for Paul, like she had done for the past 30 years. He would sit at the kitchen table, newspaper in hand, a quiet smile on his face. His presence had always been a kind of anchor for her, a rock she could depend on, even as the years passed and their children grew up and moved away. But recently, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, an edge to his tone, a distant look in his eyes, but it grew with every passing day. Helen couldn't pinpoint exactly when the cracks had started to appear. Was it the night he had forgotten their anniversary for the 3rd year in a row? Or maybe it was the evening he came home late, claiming to have been caught in traffic, but his shirt was unusually wrinkled, as if he had been somewhere else, someone else's place. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just stress from his work, but deep down she felt a tightening in her chest every time he walked through the door. The distance between them was widening, and the fear that gnawed at her was almost unbearable. It wasn't that she didn't love Paul anymore. She did. She always would. He was the man she had given her heart to when she was young, the man who had promised her the world. And in many ways, he had kept that promise. He had worked tirelessly to build a life they could be proud of. High-profile business deals, luxurious vacations, a beautiful home. But behind it all, there was a part of Paul she could no longer reach, a secret she had never been allowed to see. Helen had always believed she knew everything about him. He was open with her, at least she thought he was. Their life was shared in every way. But now, as she stood in the quiet of their home, listening to the sound of his footsteps in the other room, she realized how little she actually knew. It was as though the man she had spent 30 years loving was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't stop it. She couldn't even bring herself to confront him. Not yet. Not until she had proof. That was the moment she decided to start looking, to dig into his life the way she never had before. The first thing she did was go through his things. It wasn't something she was proud of, but there was no other way. She wasn't a snooper. She had never felt the need to be. But her intuition had begun to scream at her, and she could no longer ignore it. She started with his office. His study was a quiet sanctuary for him, where he spent most of his evenings after dinner, alone with his work. Helen knew better than to interrupt him during those hours. That was his time. But now, as she sat in the living room, waiting for him to finish another long day, she found herself standing at the door of his study, staring at the handle, wondering if she had the courage to open it. She did. Inside, the room was as immaculate as always, papers neatly stacked, leather-bound books lining the shelves. But there, on his desk, amidst the orderly chaos, lay a small black notebook. Helen had seen it before, but it had always been tucked away in the drawer. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. It was filled with numbers, seemingly random at first. But then she saw a name, Rachel. It was written in Paul's familiar handwriting, followed by a phone number. Helen's heart stopped. Rachel. The name felt unfamiliar, yet eerily significant. Was she another colleague? A business associate? Helen felt the sudden urge to pick up the phone and dial the number, but something stopped her. She wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, she slid the notebook back into the drawer and took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, but she couldn't back down now. There was something going on, something bigger than her fears, and she needed to know what it was. For the rest of the evening, she pretended everything was normal. They had dinner, talked about the mundane details of their day, Paul's meetings, his upcoming business trip. But beneath it all, Helen's mind was racing. She was torn between confronting him and keeping her discovery to herself, not knowing what would be worse, facing the truth or living in the shadows of doubt. That night, after Paul had fallen asleep, Helen lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together everything that didn't add up. She thought back to the last few months, the strange little things that had been out of place, the late nights, the erratic behavior, the way Paul had started to grow more distant. She wondered if it was just her imagination, but deep down she knew. She could feel it. The next morning, Paul was in a rush to leave for another one of his business trips. Helen stood in the doorway, watching him slip on his jacket. She had become so attuned to his movements that even the smallest change was noticeable. This morning his behavior felt off. There was a certain unease in his movements, a hurriedness in his words. As he kissed her goodbye, his lips brushed hers with less warmth than usual. "See you in a few days, darling," he said, his voice sounding strained. "Have a safe trip," Helen replied, forcing a smile. She didn't know why, but as the door clicked shut behind him, Helen felt a surge of panic. Something wasn't right. As she stood there in the silence of the house, her mind raced back to the name in the notebook. Rachel. She had to find out more. There was no turning back now. For the rest of the day, Helen busied herself with small tasks around the house, but her thoughts kept returning to that name. Rachel. What was her connection to Paul? What kind of relationship did they have? The more Helen tried to push the thought away, the more it consumed her. She couldn't help herself. She had to know. And so, the investigation began. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Helen found herself standing in front of her computer, staring at the screen. She hesitated, fingers poised above the keyboard, not knowing where to start. But then she remembered something, Paul's business trips. He had always been meticulous about keeping his work and personal life separate, but surely there would be something in his travel history that could give her a clue, a booking, an email, something. The search felt endless, but then, as her eyes scanned the screen, she found it, a hotel booking. For a place she had never heard of, for the same dates Paul had been away on one of his recent trips. It was a luxury hotel, tucked away in a remote part of the city, far from any of his business meetings. Helen's heart raced. Could this be it? Was this the key to unraveling the mystery? The silence in the house felt deafening. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, wondering what she should do next. The days that followed were a blur of quiet desperation. Helen found herself obsessively going through every detail, every small piece of evidence she could uncover. She had once been content in her marriage, basking in the stability and routine that had defined their life together. Now every corner of their home felt like it was hiding something, a shadow in the doorway, an unspoken word, a half-forgotten memory. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, as though Paul somehow knew what she was doing, knew that she was digging into the very life they had built. Every time he returned home, he seemed just a little more distant, a little less the man she had spent 30 years loving. He had grown into a stranger, someone she was trying desperately to understand. Helen had decided to follow up on the hotel booking. It had been a risk, but one she felt she had to take. The name on the reservation didn't seem familiar, nor did the address. It was a boutique hotel, the kind Paul would never have mentioned to her. He had always preferred the standard high-end chains that carried a reputation for business professionalism, not the intimate, secluded kind of places that this hotel offered. It was a late evening when she decided to visit the address herself. Her heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. As she stood outside the hotel, an old brick building nestled between two high-rise office towers, it felt like the weight of 1,000 secrets pressed against her chest. The building was modest, nothing like the luxury she had imagined. It looked almost too ordinary. She stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby greeting her with an almost oppressive familiarity. The clerk behind the counter looked up with a polite smile, and for a moment Helen felt her resolve falter. She had no real reason to be there, no legitimate excuse. But then she remembered Rachel, the name from the notebook, the woman who had suddenly entered her life as though she had always been there. With a deep breath, Helen approached the counter. "I'm sorry, I'm looking for some information about a recent guest," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was wondering if you could help me." The clerk didn't hesitate. "I'd need a name to look up," he said, his smile widening as he adjusted his glasses. Helen paused. Should she give the clerk Paul's name? Would it be too obvious? Would it raise suspicions? But then a thought struck her. Rachel's name. She didn't know why, but she felt it was important. Perhaps because it was still so unfamiliar to her, still like a puzzle piece she hadn't yet found the right place for. "Rachel Evans," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. The clerk tapped away at his computer. Helen held her breath. What would she find? "I'm sorry, there's no one by that name who stayed with us recently," the clerk said after a moment, looking up with a polite but neutral expression. Helen's heart sank. Could she have been wrong? Maybe it wasn't as bad as she thought. Maybe Rachel was just a business contact, someone Paul had met during a work event. But something told her to press on. "Are you sure?" Helen asked, her voice quieter now, almost as if she was speaking to herself. She could have checked in under a different name, maybe a company name. The clerk hesitated, his eyes darting momentarily toward the computer screen. He didn't look at her directly, but his hesitation was enough. There was something strange in the air, something that didn't feel right. Helen's instincts screamed at her. She had to know more. "No, I'm afraid I can't provide any further information without more details," he said, offering a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But if you're interested in staying with us, I'd be happy to help." Helen nodded, her mind racing. Something about this encounter felt off. Too curt, too defensive. She turned away, stepping back into the street, but her pulse was racing. Had the clerk been hiding something? Or had Rachel not been here at all? Back home, she spent the night in a restless haze, trying to make sense of it all. The hotel had yielded nothing concrete. But then, as the clock ticked past midnight, she remembered something that unsettled her even more. She had never considered it before, but now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, it seemed obvious. Paul had been using a different credit card for his recent trips. The next morning, while Paul was at work, Helen found his wallet in his office drawer, untouched for days. There, hidden behind a few receipts for gas and groceries, was another credit card, one she didn't recognize. She held it in her hand, its surface cold and unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't let this go. That evening, when Paul returned, Helen tried to act casual, hiding the fear that had been consuming her all day. Paul greeted her with a soft kiss on the cheek, his usual smile not quite reaching his eyes. He had always been a good actor, wearing the mask of the perfect husband, but tonight it seemed like the mask was slipping. Long day? She asked, taking his jacket from him. Yeah, you could say that, Paul muttered, running a hand through his hair. A lot of things to wrap up before the trip next week. Helen nodded, but her mind was already somewhere else. Somewhere far from the warm embrace of their home, in a place where trust no longer existed, and all that was left was uncertainty. As the evening wore on, Helen couldn't help but feel the tension between them thickening. It wasn't just in the air, it was in his every move, his every word. She watched him with growing unease as he fiddled with his phone, his usual attention to her fading into something distant, mechanical. She had spent years learning to read Paul's moods, his every gesture, but tonight there was something new, something cold. The phone rang just as they were finishing dinner. Paul glanced at it and then looked at Helen, his expression unreadable. "I'll take this," he said, excusing himself from the table. Helen froze, watching as Paul stepped into the next room. She couldn't hear his conversation, but she could hear his tone, low, guarded, as if he was speaking to someone who shouldn't be overheard. She tried to focus on her food, but her stomach twisted in knots. Something told her that this call, like everything else lately, wasn't as simple as it seemed. As Paul returned to the table, the unease lingered between them. He offered no explanation, no words to comfort her. And she realized then that the man she had spent her life with, the man she had trusted with everything, was slipping further and further away. He wasn't just keeping secrets anymore, he was living a lie. And Helen wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore the truth. Helen's nights grew longer, filled with restless thoughts that turned into frantic plans. She couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that clung to her like a second skin. Every glance at Paul felt like a conversation she wasn't having, every smile he offered like a lie. It was as though they were living in parallel worlds now, his hidden, her exposed. She spent the next few days obsessing over the credit card she'd found. Paul had always been careful with his finances, meticulous about keeping everything in order. So why had he kept this card a secret? What was it for? The more Helen thought about it, the more she realized that she needed to know exactly where Paul was going and what he was doing when he wasn't at home. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was the feeling that there was something much deeper, more dangerous, behind all the secrecy. The card had no name on it, just a generic company card. She debated calling the bank or digging further into his personal accounts, but fear held her back. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a misunderstanding? Yet the nagging sense that something wasn't right grew louder with each passing day. Finally, Helen did what she had promised herself she would never do. She followed Paul. It started small. A simple decision to drive by the office after he had left for what he claimed was another business trip. She wasn't planning on confronting him. No, she simply wanted to see what he was doing. The office building was bustling as usual when Helen arrived, the parking lot half filled with cars. She pulled into a space far from the entrance and sat in the car, watching the doors. An hour passed, then 2. Her heart was a hammer in her chest as she scanned the crowd of employees coming and going. It was a regular Thursday afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that Paul hadn't yet returned to his car. It was after 5 p.m., his usual quitting time. Helen's eyes narrowed when she saw him. He was standing outside the building talking to someone she didn't recognize. The man was tall, well-dressed, his face a mask of friendly indifference. But there was something about the way they spoke, their body language, that caught Helen off guard. The conversation was brief, but Paul's hand lingered on the man's shoulder for just a moment too long. When Paul turned to walk back inside, the man lingered for a moment longer, watching him with an unreadable expression. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she suddenly felt that her worst fears were coming true. There was something happening here, something more than just an affair. She drove home in a daze, her thoughts spiraling. Who was that man? Why had Paul been talking to him? Why had he looked so familiar? By the time Helen walked into the house, it was nearly dark. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen, and for a moment it almost felt like everything was normal again. Paul was sitting at the kitchen table, reading through some papers, his back turned to her. "Everything okay?" he asked, barely glancing up. Helen stood in the doorway, the weight of her discoveries settling on her shoulders like an anchor. She couldn't even speak for a moment, her mind reeling from everything she had seen. How could she confront him now? How could she make him confess when he had already lied so many times? "Yeah," she managed, forcing a smile, though it felt brittle, hollow. "I'm fine. Just needed to clear my head." Paul didn't seem to notice the tremor in her voice. He smiled at her absent-mindedly, as though nothing had changed. "Good. We're both under a lot of stress, you know," he said, standing up and moving toward her with a hand on her shoulder. His touch felt so cold, almost clinical. "I'll be away next week again, but this time it'll be good. I promise." His words felt rehearsed, as though he was trying to convince both her and himself of something that wasn't true. As he kissed her cheek and went to shower, Helen stood still, her thoughts racing. The silence between them was deafening. He was lying. She knew it. But how far did this go? What was he hiding, and how much danger had he brought into their lives? Her mind flashed back to that strange man outside the office, to the way he had lingered, to the sense of familiarity that unsettled her. She had to know who he was. She couldn't keep living in this fog of uncertainty. She knew the only way to get answers was to dig deeper, to go to the source. By the end of the week, Helen found herself standing outside the very office building where Paul had met the stranger. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But she knew that she couldn't walk away now. Her whole life had been built on the foundation of trust, and it had been shattered. She made her way past the rows of parked cars, through the side door and into the building's lobby. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Helen hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. She had no idea what she was going to say or do. All she knew was that she had to find that man. The elevator ride felt endless, the tension in her chest so thick that it seemed to press against her lungs. When the doors opened, Helen stepped into the hallway, walking briskly past rows of glass-walled offices. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed deafening in the silence. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she followed her instincts. They led her to the back office, a small, private space that had always been locked when she came by to pick Paul up after late meetings. The door was cracked open. No one was inside. Helen stepped cautiously into the room. The walls were adorned with corporate awards, photographs of team meetings, and framed licenses. But it was the desk that caught her attention. On it lay a single sheet of paper, just one, a name and a number. She couldn't help herself. She reached for it, picking up the paper with trembling hands. The name on it wasn't just a random contact. It was Rachel Evans. And beneath it, the phone number from the hotel. Helen's vision blurred. She was standing at the precipice, looking into a chasm of lies. But this was it. The final confirmation that Paul wasn't just hiding an affair. There was something much more dangerous at play. As she turned to leave, the door clicked open behind her. She froze. "Can I help you with something?" The voice was low, calm, too calm. Helen's stomach dropped as she slowly turned to face the man who had been standing just outside. The same man she had seen talking to Paul. Now, standing before her, his smile was warm. but his eyes were cold, as if they had known all along that she would come. "Who are you?" Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, and Helen felt the weight of his presence like a physical force pushing against her chest. "I think you already know," he said softly, his smile never faltering. And with that, Helen knew that she had just stepped into a world she could never leave. Helen's breath caught in her throat as the man in front of her smiled, his cold eyes fixed on her with unnerving precision. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was no longer just a wife trying to uncover a few lies. No, this had become something much darker, something far more dangerous. She could feel it, like an electric charge running through the room, making her skin prickle with an instinctive fear. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice firmer this time, though it trembled with a mix of confusion and growing terror. The man took a slow step forward, his posture relaxed, as if they were engaged in a casual conversation rather than the tense standoff that was actually unfolding. He wasn't threatening, at least not in a way she could immediately understand, but there was something about his presence that made her skin crawl. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, his voice smooth and almost mocking, as though her confusion amused him. "Your husband is very good at hiding things, but not good enough." Helen's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" His eyes flickered toward the door of the office before looking back at her, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say Paul isn't exactly who you think he is." His words hit her like a slap, the weight of them leaving her dizzy. What are you talking about? What's going on with Paul?" The man took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Let's not pretend," he said with a sigh, as if he were tired of the game. "You've been looking into him, haven't you? Digging around, the credit card, the hotel, the strange meetings. You're not stupid, Helen." Helen stood still, her pulse racing. The man was right. She wasn't stupid. She had known deep down that Paul had been hiding something, but she had never imagined this, a man who knew so much, someone who seemed to understand her life, her marriage, better than she did. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her voice rising in both fear and frustration. She needed answers now. She needed the truth. The man's smile faltered for a brief second before he regained his composure. "My name is Jack, and I think it's time you understood just what your husband's been involved in." Helen's stomach twisted, but she couldn't stop herself from pressing. "Involved in? With who? What do you know about Paul?" Jack's smile faded entirely, his expression growing serious. "Paul's not just some businessman. He's been playing a dangerous game for years, and now you're caught in the middle of it." Helen's mind was racing, every word a new puzzle piece she didn't know how to fit together. "Dangerous game? What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, as if she were afraid of the answer. "Paul's been running a side operation, something far more illegal than just cheating on you. This is bigger than anything you could have imagined, bigger than anything you could even begin to understand." Helen's world tilted. She felt the room spin around her, and for a brief second, the walls seemed to close in. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the look in Jack's eyes told her otherwise. "I know you've seen the notebook," Jack continued, his voice softening as he leaned closer. "And I know you've seen Rachel's name. She's not just some lover. She's part of something far more dangerous, something your husband is deeply involved in, something criminal." Helen shook her head in disbelief. "What are you saying? Paul? Paul's involved in something criminal?" Jack's face hardened. "I'm not telling you this because I want to scare you. I'm telling you this because you need to understand. Paul's life isn't just about you, and it hasn't been for a long time. Helen felt a rush of blood to her head, as if she were about to faint. She had always trusted Paul, trusted him with everything, but now her world was unraveling at the seams, the truth coming in waves that threatened to drown her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack took a step back, as if giving her space to process the shock he had just dropped on her. "Because, whether you like it or not, you're already involved. You've been following him, digging up things you don't want to know. You've been asking questions, and now you've got a choice to make." Helen's head spun. "A choice?" Jack's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You can stay out of this, pretend like you never saw anything, and go back to your life as if nothing's changed. Or—" his smile widened, his eyes glinting with something far darker now. "You can step into the real world and face the consequences of what you've learned." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Helen's mind raced. She couldn't go back. She couldn't unsee what she'd discovered. And yet, the very idea of diving deeper into this world of criminal activity, lies, and betrayal, terrified her more than anything she had ever experienced. "What happens if I choose the other option?" Helen whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's expression softened for the first time. "If you choose to stay out of it, you'll be safe, but you won't ever really be free. Not from him, not from the truth." Helen's gaze fell to the floor, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She had never felt so utterly lost in her life. Paul had been her everything for 30 years, but now he was nothing more than a stranger with a dangerous secret. "I don't know what to do," she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. "How do I even begin to understand this?" Jack's face softened in a way that almost seemed sympathetic. "I can't tell you what to do, but I can help you understand. If you want to, I can show you who Paul really is and where his loyalties lie." For a long moment, Helen stood frozen, caught between the safety of ignorance and the terrifying truth that Jack was offering her. She wanted to run, wanted to go home and forget everything she had learned. But something inside her wouldn't let her. Her gut told her this was only the beginning. If she didn't take this chance, she might never understand the full extent of the darkness that Paul had been hiding. "I'm listening," Helen said, her voice a mere whisper, but her resolve slowly solidifying. Jack's smile returned, this time with a hint of satisfaction. "Good. It's time you learned the truth." The days that followed felt like a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Helen felt herself sinking deeper into a world she didn't recognize, a world where nothing was as it seemed. Paul's betrayal, his secret life, had shattered her. But now, the darkness surrounding him was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Jack had been both an ally and a constant reminder of how much she didn't know. Every time he spoke about Paul's double life, the criminal network he was involved with, and the things he'd done behind her back, Helen's world seemed to crumble a little more. She was drowning in questions, in confusion, in fear. Jack had offered her a choice: to learn the full extent of Paul's criminal activities, to uncover the dangerous world he had been part of for years, or to walk away and pretend like she had never seen the truth. But Helen couldn't walk away. She couldn't just ignore the signs, the pieces of the puzzle that were now scattered all over her life. She had to know. It started with meetings. Jack's quiet insistence that she come to an old run-down warehouse on the outskirts of the city was unsettling, but there was no way around it. She had to go. Each meeting revealed a little more, small details that added up to something huge. Paul wasn't just involved in one criminal enterprise. He was part of a network, an underground group that dealt in money laundering, illegal arms, and most disturbingly, human trafficking. Helen's mind recoiled at the thought, but there was no denying it. The evidence was clear. Jack showed her financial transactions, coded messages in emails Paul had sent, and photographs that captured Paul with people Helen had never seen before, their faces masked in shadow, but their body language unmistakable. Paul had been involved in these activities for years. He had used his job as a cover. His trips, his late nights, his frequent absences were all a facade for something much more sinister. And Rachel? Rachel wasn't just a lover or a pawn. She was a key figure in the operation, someone who had access to everything. Helen could barely breathe as she sat in the dim light of the warehouse, Jack's voice like a cold wind washing over her. The weight of the information was too much to process all at once, but there was no going back now. She was in too deep. She needed to know who Paul truly was. "How long has this been going on?" Helen asked one night, her voice shaking as she stared at the photographs spread out before her. Paul's face was in everyone, always smiling, always looking so normal, so comfortable in the world of criminals. "Years," Jack answered bluntly. "Since before you two even met. He's been building this empire for a long time, and you've been living in the center of it without even realizing it." Helen felt sick, as if she had been living a lie her entire life. Every anniversary, every birthday, every family vacation, they had all been built on a foundation of deceit. "What happens now?" Helen whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Jack or herself. Jack leaned back against the cold concrete wall, his gaze never leaving her. "Now, you decide." Helen's heart pounded. I can't just ignore this. I can't go back to pretending like nothing's wrong." She shook her head in disbelief. "But I can't go to the police either. If I tell anyone, it'll destroy everything. Paul, my family, me." Jack stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. "You think it's just going to destroy you? No, Helen. You've been living in a lie. You don't get to walk away and pretend like none of this matters. This is bigger than Paul. This is about survival. If you don't make a choice now, you'll be sucked into this world, whether you want it or not." Helen felt her stomach twist. Jack was right. She was already too deep. She couldn't ignore the truth, and yet she was afraid of what would happen if she exposed it. What if the world she had known for 30 years was just a facade? What if she lost everything and everyone? But in the pit of her stomach, a voice told her that this wasn't about Paul anymore. This was about her choice, her future. "I can't live with this," she finally said, her voice steady with resolution. "I can't live with the idea that I was married to someone capable of all of this. I need to end it, Jack. I need to stop him." Jack nodded slowly, as though he had expected this answer all along. "You're going to have to be careful. If you confront Paul, he'll deny everything. He's good at hiding things. He'll try to manipulate you, make you feel like you're losing your mind." "I'm not going to let him get away with it," Helen said firmly, though a part of her recoiled at the thought of confronting Paul. After all, he had been her everything, her best friend, her partner, and now he was a stranger, a man who had deceived her for decades. The night of the confrontation, Helen's hands were shaking as she waited for Paul to come home. She had gathered the evidence. Jack had given her everything she needed and more. But there was a cold knot in her chest, and the fear of what might happen kept her from fully feeling the anger she knew she should. What would she say? How would she even begin to tell him everything she knew? The door clicked open around 8:30 p.m., and Helen felt her heart leap into her throat. Paul stepped inside, his familiar figure casting a shadow across the hallway. He smiled when he saw her, a tired, half-hearted smile that made Helen's blood run cold. "Hey, sweetheart," Paul said, his voice warm, though it didn't reach his eyes. "How was your day?" Helen didn't respond right away. She stood there, her heart racing, her mind scrambling to find the right words. She couldn't back down. Not now. She couldn't let him manipulate her again. "You've been lying to me for years," she finally said, her voice shaking but resolute. Paul froze, his expression faltering for just a second before he regained his composure. "What are you talking about?" "I know everything," Helen continued, her voice trembling but growing stronger with every word. "I know about the criminal network, the money laundering, the human trafficking. I know about Rachel, about all of it." Paul's face turned ashen. For the first time in years, Helen saw fear in his eyes. His voice shook as he stepped toward her. "Helen, please, you don't understand. Let's talk about this. You don't know what you're—" "No!" Helen interrupted, holding up the photographs and the bank statements Jack had given her. "I've seen enough. I know who you really are." Paul's expression shifted then, his calm demeanor shattered, his eyes flickering with panic. "You have to listen to me. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want you to get involved, but I couldn't stop." Helen took a deep breath. "It's over, Paul. You've already made your choices. And now, I'm making mine." The silence between them stretched out, thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Paul didn't speak again, his gaze falling to the floor, as though the man who had once been her husband had been swallowed whole by the lies he had told. Helen walked away from him then, each step feeling like the hardest one she had ever taken. The door clicked shut behind her. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what the consequences of her actions would be. But she knew one thing. She had taken control of her own life, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. As she stood outside, looking up at the dark sky, she knew that the battle was far from over. Paul would fight back. There were people out there who wouldn't take kindly to her interference, but Helen had made her decision. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost.